There we go. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about flipping the classroom, and we're going to try using Nearpod. So the basic problem that led to the creation of this modality, or a flipped classroom, the concept of a flipped classroom, is that there's been a tremendous amount of research that shows that lectures are less effective than active learning in pretty much every study that's been done in promoting knowledge retention and the transfer of knowledge, the ability to apply concepts in new contexts. The other part, though, is that students in pretty much every study believe that lectures are more effective. So that presents a bit of a challenge in that when we use techniques that are most effective, students often feel they're less effective. The most common response that anyone who's tried using a flipped classroom environment has received is something to the effect that, I don't want to teach myself. The teacher is not teaching me. I want to, I want to learn from the teacher and not be forced to learn it on myself, learn it all myself, as if somehow we could learn it for the students. But in any case, we'll talk about that in just shortly. Can you hear that siren going on? Okay, I'm hoping that will end at some point. So you've all seen Bloom's, you've all seen Bloom's taxonomy before. The lowest level is just remembering basic concepts, then understanding them, being able to classify and explain them and so forth. And then being able to draw connections, justifying a standard opinion, or produce new or original work are at the highest levels. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to try Bloom's taxonomy. There we go. I'm putting this in the chat for Barry, who just joined. If you click on this, you'll be able to interact with the slides. And so this is the new version of Bloom's taxonomy. And here I just put up a little poll. And where would you say the cognitive level of most material in introductory classes tends to be? And the answers are, there we go. And I've got this set up so you can, you can see it, I think, if you're looking at the screen, but not if you're on Nearpod. Okay, so this is how the vote turned out. And I think you should now see it. We have 2 votes for the lower levels and 1 vote for the higher level. Most research and most assessments of lectures, content in classes tends to agree with the 2 votes, with the majority there. Now, in theory, you can address some higher levels, but only if you generally make the class much more interactive. It's hard to have students creating things if you're just lecturing at students. You can get to somewhere in the middle sometimes with lectures, particularly if you include some interactive elements, and we'll come back to that. But one of the problems that we often get trapped in is that we give students material to read before class, and we tell them we expect them to read it. And then we go over some concepts, and it's clear they haven't done the reading. And in general, what many people end up doing, and I know I've done it myself, is when students come in unprepared, we end up going over lower and lower levels of the content. And then students pretty quickly discover that even if they had done the reading, they didn't really had to, because they didn't really have to, because you're going to end up going over that material anyway. So we get in this cycle where we want students to do the reading. They come to class without having done the reading, and there are ways of addressing that separately. But in general, it's really easy to fall into this routine where you spend most of your time just going over the very basic and fundamental concepts in your classes. And then the next question here is, what do students find it easiest to master on their own, assuming you provided appropriate support materials? Depending on which view you're looking at, you can either see just the question or you can see the responses. Okay, well, we've got a couple of responses in there, and they vary. We've got one of each actually, so you can now see those responses. And in general, students are able to do work that involves learning basic terms and concepts pretty easily from reading a textbook or watching videos and so forth. I think most people find that what students find most challenging is when they're asked to take the concepts they've learned and apply them in a new context. That it's pretty easy to learn the basic words and definitions, but it's much more difficult to apply those in contexts that are somewhat different. Students are pretty easily able to understand things like y equals mx plus b, but if you give them a relationship between the variables s and t, that's also a linear relationship, it's hard for them sometimes to transfer that basic concept of the intercept and slope to even just different variable names. Or if they learn how something applies in one specific case, it's a bit more challenging to see how that applies in other cases. So the main point here is that we often end up spending a lot of time in our classes going over the easier concepts, and we don't spend as much time assisting students when they most need help. When students tend to have the most difficulty in class isn't understanding the basic context in lectures, they'll usually sit there nodding and it all seems to make sense. The time when students have problems is when they're trying to apply that on assignments we give them outside of class, when they're trying to take a quiz or test or some other type of formative or summative assessment. And then we're leaving them on their own. The basic notion of a flipped classroom is we let students do the easy stuff on their own, and then we provide them with the more challenging material while they're in the classroom, and we provide them with more support. And jump in at any time if you'd like to ask a question or raise a point. And I'm going to put in a link in the chat to the Nearpod slides that we've been using. So the basic notion is, instead of lecturing at students in the class, you provide them with textbook readings or interactive readings in some form. You could provide short video lectures or other materials where they get the basic lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy on their own outside of class. And then they come to class and you work with them in active learning activities, which there's a whole list of those. And we'll talk a little bit about those later. But basically, the goal is to face them with the most challenging content when they're actually in the class and able to get some support from each other and from us. And often that involves some form of peer instruction as well as just-in-time teaching. So the peer instruction is when they're working together and helping each other in some way. And just-in-time teaching is where we do some type of a summative assessment to see what they've learned. And then we provide them with some just-in-time teaching where we might do a bit of lecturing on the topics that they're stuck on. If we see everyone in the class or a large proportion of the class isn't understanding something, then we use our class time more efficiently by focusing on the things that they don't understand rather than focusing on all the stuff that they already have mastered, so that we can use our time much more productively. Now, here's just a few examples of ways in which this has been implemented. One is, this was a tremendous example that I think got many people thinking about this. This was about 12 years ago now, I believe. San Jose State had a circuits and electronics class where there was a 50% passing rate. So 49% of the class ended up dropping the class, failing, or withdrawing from the class. And they paired it, because of that high failure rate, with a new edX MOOC that was developed, where all the students in the class learn the basic concept by signing up for the MOOC and having this mass training, basically, where they work through all the content there. And the class time was devoted entirely to problem-solving exercises, the types of things that students were generally asked to do on their own in assignments outside of class or on tests or other types of assessment. And what they found after doing this is, with the same staffing in the class, the new passing rate was 91% on similar equivalent assessments and so forth, for summative assessments. So by providing students with the support they needed, you were able to get them to learn much more effectively. And the class time was was much more effective in increasing learning. Eric Mazor, you've heard about him a lot in the past. In physics, he introduced the use of clickers and group activities with a think, pair, share type of activity with clickers, where he first has students vote, gives them a challenging question where the answer is not obvious. He has students vote on it, and then he has them discuss their answer and then vote again. And he found that using that methodology compared to the lectures he had been using before, as well as some other faculty in the department, using a pre and post test score on on a forced concepts inventory, he found that the learning gains when a flipped classroom environment were used were 3 times as large as it was when they just used a traditional lecture methodology. Carl Wyman, with several other researchers, did the same sort of thing in chemistry and found that the learning gains slightly more than doubled when they used a flipped classroom approach. In Echo 101, I did a similar type of thing, I guess back around 13 years or so ago. And I started using clickers in the class and had most of classroom time is spent where students are working on problems. And before I had introduced this, there's a standardized test in economics called the TOOS, the Test of Understanding in College Economics, which Craig is aware of. And the typical score on that was at the end of the class, students would score at about the 50th percentile. When I introduced this, the scores went up to about a 70 percentile. So it was a fairly dramatic shift. The whole distribution shifted up rather dramatically, where only about 10% or so of the students were falling below the 50th percentile. So it can lead to a fairly significant difference in student learning. So the question is, how can you do this, or how might you do this? And there's 2 basic strategies. One is you can create your own videos and learning materials. That's really time intensive and it takes a lot of effort. I did one class in the fall and one class in the spring, and it was a tremendous amount of work. And I know many faculty have done this in the last year or so with the transition to remote instruction, especially if you're going to spend a lot of time working on cleaning up the transcripts and so forth to make everything accessible. The other way of doing it is you could use existing materials, because in pretty much every discipline, there are faculty out there doing this type of thing and providing videos or other materials that you can share with your students. If you search YouTube in almost any discipline on almost any topic, you're very likely to find an array of videos. They will vary in quality. Some are really good, some are not so good, but they can serve as a basis to give some students support. And you could provide students with a mix of resources and let them pick and choose which ones are most effective. Now, just a very quick overview here. If you want to create your own screencasts, and I know Andrea had done some work on this a while back she presented on Screencast-O-Matic last summer, I believe it was. You can use Panopto. It's not bad. It'll do a screen recording, but it has a really limited set of features, and it's really challenging if you want to do any substantial editing with it. Screencast-O-Matic has a free version. The free version is a little bit limited. It puts a little Screencast-O-Matic watermark on your videos, and you don't get quite as many features. But if you want to have more, it basically just only allows you to cut and paste cut off the beginning and ending of videos, trimming them. But if you want to have a full set of editing features, and it's a pretty complete set, if you pay $1.50 a month, you can get, I think that's still the current price. This was true a few months back, but for, I think it was about $18 for the year, you get a pretty good set of editing features if you want them. For $4, you can get a wide variety of editing features, including background music and more transitions and more imagery. But the inexpensive, or even the free version, isn't bad to use. Camtasia is what I actually use. It's a bit more costly, but it's a little bit more powerful, but not dramatically so. On campus, we all have the ability to get the Adobe suite. Adobe Premiere is a very full-featured video editing package. I don't use it as much because it is so full-featured that it's a little bit more challenging because there are so many things it can do. It's sometimes harder to find how to do the basic things, or just in the menu structure is a little bit more complex. And that's my own fault for not having spent as much time with it. Pretty much the only time I use Adobe Premiere is when I have a multi-camera video that I want to do. For example, if we have a keynote speaker on campus, we may have 3 or 4 video cameras recording them, and then we can do the cuts from one camera to another. And that's pretty much the only thing I use Premiere for. But it's a very powerful editing feature if you want to play with it. Adobe Spark is a free tool where you can create screencasts and so forth. Screencastify is a free screen-based. I have to back up on this a little bit. I don't know if Screencastify still works on Chromebook. There's now a new version of Screencast-O-Matic that works on, I believe it still does. But there was a change recently where there was a Screencast-O-Matic that was available as a on Chromebooks, but now it's only available in the Chrome store. It doesn't have a direct download for Chromebooks, sorry. If you work in the Apple environment, Imovie is a really nice way of editing and creating things, either on a Mac or on a mobile phone. And you can also, on pretty much any device now, do a quick screen recording with audio of things on a Mac, on a Windows machine, on an iOS device, or in an Android device. So you can just, well, on a Mac, it's Shift-Command-5. On Windows, the Windows key, Alt and R, will directly do it. And there are, again, built-in tools on most modern mobile devices. You have to have a fairly recent release of Android to do that, but it's been on iOS for, I guess, 6 years or so now, roughly. And there's a whole variety of mobile apps. And while it's not recommended, what many people do is they just record directly in Zoom. That if you're going to, everyone has done some recordings of classes or sessions or workshops or other things in Zoom. It's basically you just talk to yourself at Zoom, which at times many of us felt we were doing anyway when all the cameras were off. So, many people just find that the easiest because it's an environment we're certainly all used to now. You still might want to edit it a little bit later, but you can do that in any of these other apps. Okay, now, just a few, if you want to try creating your own, these are just a few points, which I think many of you have heard before. Keep the video short and focused. If you normally are used to teaching 50 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes, the worst thing you could probably do is give students a 50-minute or an hour and 20-minute lecture. If you want to test it yourself, record it, and then sit there and listen to yourself for 50 minutes or 120 minutes. It's really hard to maintain focus for that sort of period. If you have, when I take material that might have been delivered in class, let's say a 50-minute class, it often becomes maybe 2 or 3 5 to 7-minute videos or 5 to 10-minute videos, because in class you generally are asking questions, you're getting feedback from students. With the videos, you don't really need to do that, and you can keep the videos short. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. One is it's easier for students to find time outside of class to watch short videos than it is to watch long videos. Another is there's a lot more cognitive load if you try throwing a lot of concepts at students, which is one of the reasons why lectures often don't work quite as well as more interactive teaching class activities. But they're easier to create, they're easier to use, and students can go back to them on demand. So there's a concept they don't understand, they can just go back to the video that's very focused on that topic and watch it as many times as they need to over the course of the semester. If you have long videos, they're much less likely to go back and review things that they need to review in order to complete some type of task. Now, to keep your workload sustainable, don't include, and this is something that many people have noted. We had a podcast a while back with Karen Costa, and she made a very big point of this. And I think we've all anyone who's been using videos in classes have probably run into this. You don't want to include any mention of your current course or the current season or the current weather or anything related to that particular time period, because if you are creating videos on the topics that students need to review, those concepts are probably going to be helpful in future semesters as well. And if you switch from teaching in the fall to the spring, a reference to the weather getting colder in May, well, outside of Oswego, may not work quite as well as it would if it was back in November, let's say, when they were hearing that. So try to keep the content evergreen so that it will work in other periods, so you don't have to keep redoing these regularly. A really useful strategy, and one I've been having videos in my classes now going back to about, I think, 2012 or 13 or so, in at least in my large classes. But what I've been doing the last 2 years now is embedding questions in videos. And that's a really good way of, among other things, making sure that students watch material before coming to class. Because even if you try a flipped class, students may not think they're going to have to actually do that work outside of class before coming to class. And one way of ensuring that they do is just including a few questions that they have to answer that ends up in the gradebook at a trivial grade. I've been using PlayPosit as a particular tool for this, and I let them watch the videos as many times as they want, and they basically have to answer all the questions, and it just keeps their most recent score. So if they watch a video and they're still not understanding some concepts, they can go back and do it again. And that gives me some good feedback, and it's telling me what they're not picking up from the video that they need to. So if I want to work on improving the video, I can go back and address those things. Or I can put in other questions that will build to the concepts I was hoping they would address to help them scaffold their work to get to that level of understanding. There's some nice tools you can use. Panopto is good, but you can only put one question in the gradebook, in a video that ends up in a gradebook column, unless you want to have multiple gradebook entries in a single video. And that's probably a little bit more unwieldy. Edpuzzle and PlayPosit both offer free versions that will allow you to put a certain number of videos or have a certain number of students. I believe Edpuzzle, well, I should check on the amounts before saying, but there are free versions that would let you experiment with these and try it, where there's a limitation on either the number of students that can view the videos and interact with them, or there's a limit on the number of videos you can post using those tools. But it's not a bad idea to try them and just to see how it works. And students have said in my classes that this was one of the most productive and one of the most helpful tools that they found. Now, I had many videos out there before, but until they got a very small share of the grade, it's a fraction again of the grade for any video, they didn't always watch them, or the people who did watch them were the students who were at the border between an A- and an A, who were just trying to make sure that they got the A in the class. The students who were struggling to get a C- were the least likely to watch the videos until they got some credit for it. So it can be helpful that way. But if you want to use videos, there's all sorts of sources out there. There's YouTube, which, as I mentioned, Crash Course has a whole series of videos in many disciplines, not all of them. They have some superb ones in economics, and they have some really good ones in history and many, many disciplines. And it's worth looking through it. That's created by John Green and his brother and some other people. And yeah, there was a question in the chat. Can you use PlayPosit with Screencast-O-Matic? Yes. Basically, the separate issues that the embedding the questions in videos works by taking videos you've already created. Screencast-O-Matic is used to create videos, which you typically post on YouTube or somewhere else. What PlayPosit does is it will take the videos you've already created, suck them into this environment where you then are able to put questions right on the timeline. So you get to a certain point and you ask students a question. It could be a multiple choice question. It could be an open-ended free response question, or it could be a fill in the blank question. It could be a matching question. It could even be a discussion forum right at that point in the video. So there's a lot of options. So the two are somewhat separate. You create the videos and then you can choose to put questions in them. And you can do that with videos created anywhere, as long as they're publicly available on the web somewhere. Okay. But if you want to, and furthermore, with PlayPosit and Edpuzzle, you don't even have to create the videos to embed questions in them. I've always felt a little uncomfortable about that, but you could take a publicly available YouTube video and suck that into your course and embed questions into it, where I felt a little uncomfortable. I would feel a little uncomfortable putting questions in the middle of someone else's video and using that as a learning tool, but that's probably the most common use of both Edpuzzle and PlayPosit. So essentially you're having students watch a video out there and they are then being quizzed on it in the middle of that. And you can look at the responses later on to see what they're getting out of that and so forth. Khan Academy has videos on many areas, particularly in the STEM fields, but on a wide variety of things. TED-Ed is something very similar to PlayPosit or Edpuzzle, but anything you create then becomes public and other people can use that. And there was a question, is a particular software you'd advise to use with Screencast-O-Matic? For me, the easiest software to use is, I would say either Edpuzzle or PlayPosit. And they're both pretty easy. It does take a little bit of time to get the questions in a place in the video where it's not in the middle of a word. But you can, with a little bit of timing, it's not very hard to do. Basically, in either one, you just select the video, it reads it in, and then you scroll along the timeline, find where you want to put the question, you click insert question, and then the question is right there. And then you can invite your students to use that. Another thing you could use in some cases, if they're available, are the adaptive and personalized learning software platforms, such as the ones we get through being part of SUNY for free with the Waymaker and the Open Learning Initiative, which again, we have access to any Waymaker package, which is created by Lumen Learning, or any OLI package, which is created by the Carnegie Mellon Initiative. And the difference between the two is an adaptive learning platform is sort of like a black box where it will guide students through the material based on how they respond to questions and so forth. A personalized learning platform such as Waymaker is one where students get to choose what areas to review, but it's giving them feedback, telling them whenever they take an assessment, what areas they've mastered and what they need to go back and review. And again, the research on this is fairly dramatic because both Waymaker and the OLI packages are used in literally hundreds or thousands of classes. And so they've got data on hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions with some of the packages, students who've taken these classes, and they use them to revise them. And they use them to see where students are getting stuck. And they update the materials based on where students are having bottlenecks, where they're not learning materials effectively. And both OLI and Lumen Learning update them at least annually. And in the case of Lumen, I believe every 6 months or so they do. At the end of each semester, they review the data and they update it to improve the package. Merlot has been around for a long time. It's a set of open learning initiative, or it's an archive or a collection of online, it's a learning object depository online where you can find learning materials that people have created. Some of them are very recent, some go back to like 15 years or so, but you can find some really good materials in there. And again, as in the case of the San Jose course, the circuits and electronics course, you might be able to find materials in a MOOC that you can use in order to support your class. In particular, in SUNY, all of the SUNY Coursera MOOCs that have been developed on any campus or across campuses, one of the restrictions on getting a grant for developing those materials under the SUNY contract is that anything you create is shareable by others. So they're all released under a Creative Commons requirement. So any videos, any learning materials and so forth created in a SUNY MOOC, you could simply suck into your own class with appropriate attribution and use those resources in support of your students. Or you could just have students sign up and complete a part of a MOOC, for example, if it's relevant to your course. And there's a lot of open courseware sites out there. MIT has been involved. Well, many institutions now have faculty share some of the materials they've created. Here, I just want to, I'm partly experimenting with this. If you're in Nearpod, if you have any suggestions on learning activities that you found that you've either used or that you think might be useful in a flipped classroom environment, please feel free to type it in. It should be popping up on the Nearpod app. And again, if you're not in the Nearpod, you can just get to it by clicking on that link. Or you could just unmute or just, type something in chat or unmute. Okay, Barry has case studies, questionnaires, and Kahoots. Kahoots are a nice way, well, any of those could be a nice way of doing some retrieval practice, but Kahoots in particular, students find remarkably engaging. I've been amazed at how much students enjoy it. And some of it seems to be that music that just plays in a loop in the background.
But you can change the music.
You can, yes.
They do get sick of that music.
It can get tiring. Most of the loops that come with it, though, are, I think, of a similar style, but you can at least vary it a little bit. I'm not sure if you can use your own. I don't think so, but any other thoughts on that? Okay. Now let's go. Oh, okay. And Jigsaw, think, pair, share, and 5-minute papers are another way of doing a bit of this. Yeah, and is everyone familiar with the Jigsaw approach? Okay, with the Jigsaw.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Okay, with a Jigsaw approach, basically you take a topic and you divide it up into subtopics, and you split your class into, you assign students to each of those subtopics. You generally have 2 levels of groups. You have, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. You sort the students first into the subtopics, and then you combine one person from each. You have students learn the subtopic on their own. You have them meet with the other people who have mastered that subtopic and explain it to each other so they can fill in the gaps and come up with a standard uniform explanation and reinforce their own learning through that peer activity. And then you send them back to another set of groups where there's one person from each subtopic who will then explain it to the other people in their group. And Andre, would you say that's pretty much how you've used it? Okay, and then you want to make sure that they tend to learn best the material that they've mastered, but you then want to create some sort of accountability to make sure that the other students have learned it as well. And a simple thing you can do is ask the people who didn't master the material, who weren't responsible for explaining it to the others, to explain it to the whole class. And if students know that they might be called on to do that sort of explanation to the whole class, it tends to encourage them to spend more focus, perhaps, or more focused attention on listening to the other people rather than just focusing on their own explanations. And that can be really useful. It's a nice way of engaging in peer instruction where there's a small groups interaction at the 2 levels, and also in just having them bounce the ideas off of each other and making learning a much more cooperative activity. Okay, so those were the things that came in there. And moving on. Now there's also, I have a set of slides from another activity that Rebecca and I did last in January. We're not repeating that one this time, but I'm sharing a link to that because it has a whole lot of activities. Let me just bring that over here for a second, just to give you a quick overview of some of the things that are there. And some of this is drawn from a presentation that Judy Littlejohn and I had done at the All-C conference last year, if this ever loads. And it seems to be particularly sluggish with that right now. Oh, there it goes. Let's see. Okay, it's making a copy first. I thought I had the direct view link. Here we go. And if you just, we'll just skim through this quickly. There we go. This we put together for use in Zoom, but you can do polling, you can use whiteboards, you can use short Google Forms to get some feedback. You could have students working in breakout rooms and then reporting back, just-in-time teaching activities to address the muddiest points. And then we've got a whole list of things in here. So look through that. The Jigsaw, Think, Pair, Share are part of it. There's a fishbowl approach where you have small group presentations, role-playing activities, debates, and various games, including things like Kahoots. You can have students engage in applications of knowledge. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but these are all here. So, so that's, again, something else you can do. And here, I wanted to try the Nearpod whiteboard tool. So I believe you can now see that if you're in the app, and you should be able to post sticky notes on there. I first started working with Nearpod at 12:30 today, so I'm a little bit new to this, but I do have to give a presentation that includes this tomorrow. So, so if you're in Nearpod, you should be able to just put a little sticky note up. Do you see the whiteboard tool or the corkboard tool, I guess, in there? And there's a sample sticky note. Okay, it works. And then other people can like the sticky note, the post. Okay, so I'm using the free version of Nearpod. And what do you think of it, by the way, having the slides there? I don't know how useful that would be, but it does allow for real-time interactivity in a class if you're not using something like clicker software or polling software or other things. And it would be free for students to be able to do polling and other things. And you'd have an instructor view where students, here it's kind of a mix because it's being done in Zoom, but you'd be able to see only what the instructor shares from the polls and only when the instructor does it, if it was actually in the classroom and not being done through Zoom. Okay, well, in any case, oh, and these are the slides. This is the set of slides that I put together. I'll share that too. So this is the entire set of slides that we just went through. So I'll stop talking. And what are your thoughts?
My biggest concern is that, and I tried to do this a little bit last semester because we were face-to-face, but I had hybrid, so I only saw them once per week. But they had to watch a video and then we practice in class. But my biggest concern is that a lot of times the students don't put in the work or put in the very bare minimum. Like in theory, if people are doing this, I agree with this 100%, and I think this is the best way to run it. But if they're not doing that, or even a large percentage are not doing it, then it almost seems that the lecturers at least get them some of that material, as opposed to if they all show up and have no idea what's going on, and then you start practicing and they have no idea what's going on, and you never actually get to that level. So that's my biggest concern, is how to actually You know, you can do the questions and the clickers. I had a homework that they had to turn in ahead of time. But a lot of times they put in bare minimum efforts, like they'll skip to the questions and just put something down, even if it's for no points, or they won't, you know, do anything at all. In that case, you're kind of lost as to, you know, trying to, you know, practice with these tools that nobody seems to have. Or if you pair them up and say everybody needs to teach something and some people just don't have their material mastered or have anything, then what is that class? That whole section doesn't get that material. So I guess, and then, or you go back to lecturing essentially.
Yeah. One strategy that I know some people have used is a team-based learning approach where you have persistent team from the beginning to the end. And one issue is you often will have one or two people in a group of, say, 5 or 6, which is a typical size of a team-based learning team who doesn't prepare in advance, but it creates a sort of positive peer pressure where if they're coming in unprepared and they're not able to help, the peers will sometimes remind them that it would be really helpful if they did, so that there's, instead of having a peer pressure or peer environment that discourages participation, if they're going to be quizzed on material and as a group, and you know, and some people aren't prepared. An interesting thing is one of our colleagues in economics a few years ago, he left, he's at Penn State right now, Bill Goff, was using a team-based learning approach. And what would happen is that if a student didn't show up because they were sick one day, the teammates would often complain because they missed him, that they missed that person's contribution. And having that sort of positive environment where people were encouraged to prepare to help each other out and not to let down their teammates could help. You know, because I often teach a large class, you know, that it would be harder to maintain that sort of structure in a large group. I've done a number of things to help ensure that. One is I've had short quizzes that are due before class based on the assignments. And I let them do them multiple times, but they're due right before class. Another thing I had used once is something like a 5-minute paper or an exit ticket, but instead of doing it in class, I had them do it after they completed the readings, where I just asked them what they learned, just, you know, very briefly, what they learned from that day's assignments, where I told them exactly what they needed to read or what videos to watch. And then also, what did they still have questions about? What would they like to learn more about? And then, you know, then I'd have that due about 2 or 3 hours before class. And then I'd always, when I gave them questions in class, I would refer back to the things that they had said as things they were still confused about or that they wanted to learn more about. But it was done by asking them questions about it that would help them build up to a deeper understanding of the material. And, you know, if students see, if you're using polling software, for example, and they're being graded on it, if they see that 60 or 70 or 80% of the other students are able to answer the questions that they're not, it puts a little bit of pressure on them to realize that maybe they do need to put in a bit more time. Now, if you're asking really challenging software, it gets a little bit you know, tricky. And normally what most of us do who use polling techniques is to give some credits for any response and then more credits if they answer it correctly. For example, I give them three points for answering a question, 5 points for answering it correctly. So if they just attempt all the questions, they're guaranteed a 60 for that day's polling type questions. But you know, if they want to get a perfect score on it, they've got to do a lot more work to get up to there. Now, there's a question. Okay, there's a couple questions from Janet. Could you give me an example of a group assignment outside of or in class that you use? Well, for example, in a simple introductory economics class, I might just ask them to explain, where I have them read up about demand curves and supply curves and what factors shift demand. And I'll give them a simple scenario, or what should be a simple scenario, asking them what would happen if the price of a substitute good changes to the equilibrium price and quantity. I let them vote on it, and then I'll let them discuss it and then vote again on it after they've had a small group discussion. And And it's challenging giving them feedback with written assignments in a class. Since I often teach a class of like up to 420 students, there's not a lot I can give in terms of detailed feedback. But when I had them do that, that exit ticket type thing after doing the readings, I had it done through a Google form where I would just copy down, if it was worth, say, 5 points for that day, I'd copy a 5 down. And then if I saw that someone had answered something very superficially or didn't really address the question, I'd take off some points for that. So they could see that they couldn't just post anything there. But when I saw it all in a spreadsheet, I was able to get a pretty good feel for where students were having trouble with. And, because this is a class I've been teaching since the 1980s, I have a pretty good idea of what students are going to get stuck on. And those are the questions that I tend to focus more time on anyway. So I generally be able to have material already prepared without doing that. Now, the question is, what polling software would I recommend in Blackboard? I would not recommend the, well, in Blackboard. In Blackboard, you can use a survey thing in Blackboard or, the quiz type tools in Blackboard. But if you're asking about Zoom, I wouldn't recommend the Zoom polls unless you just want some really superficial results. It's really hard to get anything out of there. Okay, in Teams. Well, I think Janet's at Oneonta, and I believe that you may have a license there for, what is the name of that company? It's a polling company. We use iClicker at Oswego, and it looks like there's a good chance we might be getting a site license for that for the fall. That's still a little bit up in the air. And that students can either vote using physical clickers. Right now, students have to buy a physical clicker if they're in person or a mobile app if they're participating remotely. They pay either, if they're getting the mobile technique, the mobile device or the mobile app, they pay either $16 for 6 months, $24 for a year, or something like $42 or $43 for a 4-year license, which they can then use in as many classes as they want. Yeah, and I think that you do, and I forgot the name of it. It's the company that once they find you on the mailing list, will call you 5 or 6 times a year and send you emails when you don't respond to their previous emails. They spend an awful lot on marketing. It's a good product. They also market OER text with content embedded in them. But there's a lot of good options for polling. In smaller classes, I've also used Socrative for polling because it doesn't cost students anything. And the free version is good for up to 50 students. And if you pay something like $50 a year, you can have it for groups of up to 250. That doesn't work in my class, but that will work in most people's classes. Any other thoughts or questions?
John, just a quick thing. In my compensation and benefits class in the business school, we have a computer simulation. They have to work a lot of it offline, in groups, however they want to do it. And they come to class and they discuss the concepts. So what we've talked about so far is engaging them more or increasing accountability by testing their subject matter, whether it's a poll or a quiz, whatever. In addition, I do something else, and because I'm a social scientist and psychologist, pardon me, but what I do is, for instance, in organizational behavior, they've already had those OB kind of courses, and they've talked about group dynamics. So we talk about the typical group roles, and I asked them for each, I think there's 4 reports that they have to do throughout the semester. So it's a semester long, and they build a compensation program for a company. And what I asked them to do is person by person reflect on the role they took for that particular report. And they're encouraged to rotate the roles.
That's a really good active learning exercise, and it's at the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy.
I mean, if they weren't there participating, they've got nothing to say, right? If they right, they have to really reflect, and they go up Bloom's taxonomy for sure. Now, that being said, they all see each other's reflection. So if someone is say wasn't there and is just kind of making it up as they go, my experience is early on that person's called on that, and it doesn't happen again. What I haven't done is they've got no skin in the game. It doesn't count for any points. So that could increase accountability even further. So yeah, so I'm a big fan of incidental learning. It's not compensation subject matter, but it's group dynamics, and they're all going to be on teams, and that's an easy sell.
Yeah, and you can talk to them about how this is something you're going to be doing no matter where they're working or what they're doing, and that those are skills that it's really important to develop.
Exactly.
And one thing that's often recommended is if you do have group activities, particularly with persistent groups, that you allow some time for group processing to talk about what's working, what's not working, and what areas they need to improve to make their teams more effective. Otherwise, you'll be getting all the complaints saying this person's not doing anything. And it's much better to encourage them to work it out themselves, because again, that's a really useful skill.
Right. I told them right up front. They said, we've got 6 or 7 groups. They're all HR majors in this particular class. And somewhere along the line, my prediction is 1 or 2 groups will have difficulties working together, and you will call me and say, fix it. And this is exactly what I'm going to say, and so they know up front that I'm not going to go in and swoop in and be a one instructor SWAT team here. They have to solve their own problems, and I'll coach them along the way. But there's always, it seems, 6 or 7 groups. There's always one, for sure, maybe 2 that have somebody who's a social loafer or whatever. Yeah, we've all been there, I'm sure.
And, depending on the level of the classes, all sorts of projects you can have students do. I had students, for example, write a book in my capstone course this past semester. And they picked the topics, they worked as a whole class group to come up with a topic. Then they picked subtopics within that for the chapters that their group was going to work on. And there was a lot of intrinsic motivation. So this is the first time I really didn't have any group dynamic problems other than one student who just sort of disappeared. But, and that happens. And certainly it's been happening a lot more this year than is normal. But there was really only one person who did that. Now, there were a couple of people who did some plagiarizing issues, but that was another issue.
And that's during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see any increase in group issues? Well, of course, you just said you haven't experienced much.
Actually, I've been seeing the group activities working better during the pandemic than in the past, partly because I used to hear students complaining they didn't like group work and so forth. I didn't hear any of that this year. And I think partly it's that students really seem to enjoy having contact with other students and doing cooperative activities when they weren't getting to see them as often or as regularly. One of the things I had students do last semester was create podcasts. And because I had a lot of groups, I asked them to keep them all to 5 to 10 minutes, but they sent me recordings that were up to like 40 minutes long. And a lot of it was just kind of getting to know each other. They didn't do a lot of editing or planning with that first round, but, but I could hear it. And it took an awful long time to get through all of the first drafts of that first podcast. It was nice to hear them making those connections and forming them. And I think that might not have happened so much. It didn't happen quite as much back before the pandemic when I've done this sort of project.
I see.
So I think students were hungry for more connections. So I think the group projects work in my classes, at least, which is a very small sample, they seem to be much more successful than in the past. Any other thoughts or questions? The main thing, and I alluded to this at the beginning, and I meant to get back to it earlier, is just letting your students know that this type of approach is effective, that it's being done for a reason, that you're doing this because it really does help them learn more, and that they learn by trying things, struggling with things, and wrestling with the concepts. They really don't learn as well when they just listen to you talk. It may seem easier to them. It's when they actually try to engage in those higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy where it's more challenging, but they're going to get to those points sooner or later. And it's better to have them do it in class where you can support them more. So selling them on that and doing that regularly, I think is really key to being successful. Any other thoughts? Okay, we're about out of time. So it was good seeing everybody. And we have a next session up at 2 o'clock. So I'm going to end this session so I can get the video rendering in the background. And then we'll be back in just a couple minutes. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
John.
Bye.